Okay, hi everyone. Let's get started as more people sign in. Welcome back to Cafe Oleh. My name is Jay, and here at Cafe Oleh, we go over the everyday Hebrew you need here in Israel to succeed, whether that's reading and paying your utility bills, growing grocery shopping, and reading nutritional labels, keeping up with the news, striking up a conversation, all the everyday uses of English, the everyday uses of language that you use in your native countries, your native tongue, but here in Israel in Hebrew. And particularly focusing also on the Hebrew they don't teach you in more formal places. So whether that's Ulpan, day school, yeshiva, your previous times in Israel, whatever it may be. As always, we want to hear from you what topics you'd like us to cover. So if you have any topics, as you see here in the chat prompt, please email us. You can also in the chat window if you have any topics you'd like us to cover. All of our previous lessons are up on YouTube. Last week's class was delayed a few days in going up for various reasons. So we thank you for your patience while that gets sorted. Today's class and the next few classes are actually brought directly from you. You requested these topics. You'd ask for these topics. We want to incorporate them as much as possible. And I'm particularly excited for this class today. This class today, we're gonna start tackling a topic that frankly no one has addressed head on the way we're going to, I think at all. Which is the issue of exceptions to the rule. Okay, exceptions to the rule or irregular words or verbs. I hear this a lot from native English speakers in particular, but anyone who's learning Hebrew. Why are there so many irregularities in Hebrew? Today, we're going to address that question in a slightly different way. And I am thanking you in advance for your patience. We're actually not going to use the spreadsheet this time because we're doing a little bit more grammar than vocab. We're going to use a PowerPoint presentation. Don't worry, you'll get a copy of this along with the recording of this YouTube. You don't have to take any notes if you don't want to. You can just sit back and watch. You can certainly screenshot, ask any questions you would like about this specific lesson in the Q&A. If you have any questions as we're going along with anything not related to this class, please relegate that to the chat only. So let me share my screen in just a second. Okay, just 1 second. Let me pull it up. Here we go. You will also see one of our view. You'll also see the start of our new rebranding of Cafe Oleh. It's not just in terms of getting the spreadsheets, the vocabulary, but also our new logo. You're going to see a lot more changes in the weeks to come. I want to focus on this class, this topic, because not only many of you asked for it, it often comes up when we're learning any language, in particular Hebrew. And what do I want to address today is actually Hebrew's doesn't have so many exceptions and doesn't have so many irregular words. That may cut the lesson really short and we can go home right now, right? There are things that strike us as odd, that strike us as irregular in what we are normally taught when we conjugate words, when we conjugate verbs, as being weird or irregular. And sometimes the teacher goes into explanation why that is so, or sometimes they don't. And we're left with feeling like this is an irregular thing or an exceptional thing. And even if it's called an exception, they don't really explain why that is. What I'm going to try to attempt to do today, I'm not going to go through all the words out there that you may find irregular or exceptional. I'm going to go through some big ones and their sources of it and why we call them that. Okay. So first off, before we get started, and I want to say this as unpatronizingly as possible, we need to recognize our own bias when we ask this question. Why are there exceptions to the rule? Why are there so many irregular words in Hebrew? And it's not just my answer before, there really aren't. We need to take a step back and understand where we're coming from in learning any other language than our native one, especially my fellow native English speakers. So first off, what are our own biases in learning any language, not just Hebrew, but in particular Hebrew? First off, English. Okay, English is chock full of irregular words and exceptions to the rule. Chock full of them. Think about when you had to memorize going verbs, or when some adjectives get more and most, and some are bigger and biggest, and some are not. They have to be more blank or most blank, right? We have to learn these and memorize them. Hebrew doesn't really have that. It's very few and far between. English is chock full of them. That also has to do with the development of the English language, that even though it's technically a Germanic language in the same family as German and Dutch and Norwegian and Swedish and Danish and all those others, we have so many loan words from Latin and so many loan words from Greek that all those grammatical rules get sort of mushed together into what we call modern day English. So when you ask that question, recognize the difficulty in it, right? I've talked about this before. Recognize when you have trouble with accents, especially in modern Hebrew, like with the letter resh. And I have pushed back on that, not to say that an accent isn't bad. I think an accent is perfectly all right, so long as you're understood in what you're saying. But keep in mind that the letter R, and that sound in English, is one of the hardest sounds for non-native speakers to learn. And it's one of the last sounds that a child learns when they're learning English for the first time. So again, recognize our own biases here. Second one, Hebrew incorporates gender, right? We don't have gender working in the same way in English like we do in Hebrew. Other languages have gender as well. If you've ever learned a Romance language, you know this well. But it's another step in trying to get ourselves understood, because we have to conjugate with this other dimension, gender. It's very human to focus on what's different. Those of you who remember Sesame Street, there's that one skit, that one song, one of these things is not like the other, right? We're immediately taught, and it's our immediate normal way of understanding the world by understanding what things are not, how things are different. So it's also, we immediately go to the exceptions, whether we are cognizant or not as human beings. And the last one is a really important one. I hope we can all ingrain into our heads in learning any language, particularly Hebrew, that we have to make mistakes when learning languages. Okay, so if you make a mistake and something was meant to be conjugated one way or another, and that is irregular because 90% of the time it's something different, it's okay. You're supposed to make mistakes when learning a language. I know that's also, as it says here, at odds with our desire to understand and be understood as quickly as possible, right? We're Olim, we're Jews who chose to move to Israel. That puts us up in an even higher obligation, I'd like to think, in wanting to be part of Israeli society. Whether we call ourselves Israeli or not, we are. By paper, by act of aliyah, we are Israelis. And with that comes the Hebrew language. How quickly we get to that, we often grade ourselves on how good we are as an immigrant, as an Oleh, or as an Israeli. Stop putting so much pressure on yourselves. Understand, learning a language, any language, comes with mistakes. Even the most brazen, self-confident, cocky native Israeli learning English is going to make mistakes. That's part of learning a language. You have to make mistakes in order to grow. Okay, so another important thing, I've said this repeatedly, I finally put it into a graphic form so you can get this down. Why Hebrew has so few exceptions. Almost all the time everything can be explained. Why? Because Hebrew is 7th grade algebra. I've said this before, I finally put it into a graphic form. I'm still working it out, but this is what we're gonna work with tonight. X times Y equals XY. I've said this before, here now you can visualize it. X times Y equals XY is the vast majority of the Hebrew you're ever going to learn and certainly going to use. X times Y equals XY. X is the root, is the shoresh, is those 3 letters that are the root of the vast majority of words you're going to use. Nouns, adjectives, adverbs, verbs, whatever it may be. Y is the form, right? Normally when we talk about form, we talk about the binyan, the specific conjugation as a verb, or the mishkal, the extra letters and or vowels that we add to the shoresh to give it meaning as a noun or an adjective. But form also includes person. Is it first person, second person, or third person? First person, I, we. Second person, you. Third person, he, she, or they. Okay. Tense. Is it past tense? Is it present tense? Is it future tense? And gender, like I said before, male or female. Right? So all those things go into the Y. So if you take the shoresh and you multiply it, you combine it with the form, you get XY, you get a milah, a word. And a word, a milah in Hebrew, is the combination of the shoresh and the form. What's also important is that both the shoresh and the form also have their own meanings. They come with their own attachment to it. I'm going to show you an example in a second, okay? But as I've said repeatedly in the past, and I want you to keep this down because this helps a lot of people. I was just at, I met with family friends the other day, and when I explained to them, when one person was complaining that they weren't learning Hebrew so well, and and I explained, "Are you good at math?" And they said, "Yeah," and I said, "Great. Hebrew is 7th grade algebra. X times Y equals XY. Remember that, you're good to go." Okay, let me show you in how this actually looks in application. Okay, I kept it up here. I just put it at the bottom. X times Y equals XY, right? We're going to take the shoresh, the X, at here at the top. Kaf, tet, taf, bet. Kaf, taf, bet. Okay, kaf, taf, bet has something to do with writing. Every time it shows up, it has something to do with writing. We're going to multiply it, that middle dot, by the binyan pa'al, which is one of the 7 verb conjugations. Don't worry if you don't know that, but I'm just explaining it to you as we go along. And shem poal means the infinitive form of a verb, the to do something. Okay, so in this case, I want to conjugate kaf, taf, bet. I want to plug in that shoresh, that root, into the pa'al binyan infinitive. Okay, so katava, into that, we get, here on the right-hand side, lichtov. We get the word lichtov. Lichtov means to write. Okay, so just by plugging into this equation, x, shoresh, kaf, taf, bet, and y, the form, binyan pa'al, that's the name of one of the 7 conjugations, verb conjugations, shem poal, and we're specifically conjugating for the infinitive, we get the word lichtov. Let's do it again, this time for a noun. Kaf, taf, bet, the same root we had before, right? That means something to do with writing. And now we're going to use a mishkal. You see here at the bottom, I wrote binyan for verbs. That's what we call the different conjugations for verbs. And a mishkal is the format we use for nouns and adjectives. Both of these are the letters and or vowels that we attach to the shoresh to give them a specific meaning. Okay, so in this case before, as you see here, lichtov, right? To get to lichtov from katav, we had to add a lamed, a vav, a lamed at the beginning and a vav between the last 2 letters. And we added the vowels, excuse me, I, O, li, O. Okay, so we just, li, O is the infinitive form of binyan pa'al. We plugged in the shoresh, ka, ta, va, and we got lichtov. Okay, let's do the same thing with one of the mishkalim that we use for creating nouns and adjectives. There's actually a lot of these. Verbs, there's only 7. In Hebrew, the mishkalim, which is the plural of mishkal, which means a weight, that we use for nouns and adjectives, there's a lot of them. No one actually learns all of them at once, but we know the big ones. We can recognize them. This is a big one. This we call, instead of using the letters pe, ayin, lamed, like we used for verbs, we use kuf, tet, lamed. Don't worry, you don't need to know these. I'm just illustrating how this works. Okay. Mishkal, it's called miktal. Okay, because miktal indicates the how we're going to say this shoresh conjugated, right? So you can already, just like we did with Shema Poal, which is li o, here we're going to do the mishkal miktal. All we have to do is sub in those letters into this form here, this mishkal. So we get from miktal, we get, and for the singular, michtav. Yachid means singular, michtav. X times Y equals XY. X, the shoresh is kaf, taf, bet. Y, the mishkal is miktal, and we are also yachid. We want a singular of this form. Michtav is a letter. Okay, X times Y equals XY. Don't worry if you don't know all the shorashim. No one has learned all the shorashim in the world. Don't worry if you don't know all the different forms there are. Okay, that's not what this lesson is about. And not even native Hebrew speakers know every single shoresh that is out there or every single form that is out there, but they can look at a word and from it, they can do the reverse, right? If a native Hebrew speaker saw the word michtav, they would be able to deduce from it immediately what is the shoresh, and they can figure out what is the mishkal. Even if they don't know the actual name for it, they can certainly say, okay, it's something mi'ah. Okay? That's what I'm asking you to discover here in this class. And thus, anytime you're using Hebrew whatsoever, all Hebrew words, that 90, at least 90% of the Hebrew words you're ever going to use in life come from X times Y equals XY. I don't want to sound patronizing. It legitimately is that simple. X times Y equals XY. Okay. So why are there exceptions? Okay, why are there exceptions? If I just made it clear that 90% and even more than 90% of these words are X times Y equals XY, and that's a predictable thing that happens again and again, why are there exceptions? Well, again, there's two main reasons why there are exceptions. One is, as I say here, proper pronunciation. Okay, proper pronunciation in order to understand and be understood. I think a lot of people forget when they're learning a language, and it's why I emphasize it here a lot in this class. Just because I'm teaching you the word doesn't mean I expect you to use the word. You're going to hear the word I'm teaching. You're not necessarily going to use the word, right? Language is about communicating, and communicating goes both ways. If you want to be understood, you have to understand, and vice versa. Proper pronunciation, we can break down into two things. One is aesthetics, and the other is how can we make language as stress-free as possible to utter. First off is aesthetics. Aesthetics is really simple. What sounds pleasing to our ears, right? There are certain aesthetics that come with each language. What sounds right, as well as what sounds correct and pretty. What sounds pleasing to our ears. There are certain combinations that if you say it in a way, it's not going to sound good. It ain't going to sound good. It's not going to sound well. Okay, there's one example. And second, how can we make language as stress-free as possible to utter? Language shouldn't be stressful on our body to articulate. And Hebrew in particular emphasizes that it physically forces us, and we're going to do an exercise together, even across the webinar here with 230 people on this call, and even more about to sign in. We're going to do an exercise shortly, a physical exercise to show that Hebrew makes it as stress-free as possible to physically utter words. It contorts all the different parts that make up sound, your throat, your tongue, your jaw, your nose, to ensure that you can say these words as effortlessly as possible. That's why we don't have a word like effortlessly in Hebrew. And that it's not putting undue strain on you. That's a really key part. And that's also going to be a good clue for you when we get to it, when words sound right or not right, oftentimes is the stress, in addition to the aesthetics. Does it sound correct as well as pleasing? But also, is it stressful to say? And is it stressful to say under Hebrew phonology, meaning the table of sounds that Hebrew has, not the table that English has? I get a lot of this, and I understand this frustration comes because we're comparing it to English. We're not talking about English here, folks. We're talking about Hebrew. Hebrew has its own sounds, just like English has its own sounds. Remember that letter R? Thank God it doesn't exist in Hebrew. It has its own unique sounds, but that's not what we're talking about here. Hebrew. How do we make Hebrew as stress-free as possible to utter for within the Hebrew range of sounds, vowels, and consonants that it has? And then the second one, why there are exceptions, and this is less of a rule, but it shows up every once in a while, is that older grammatical rules have been made simpler in modern Hebrew. One of the many processes to get to modern Hebrew in the last 130 years, 140 years, 150 years, was changing some of the grammar, but also a lot of compromise between how do we actually pronounce the language. Because remember, it was only used in very specific settings, primarily religious. And so Ashkenazim come with their specific pronunciation of Hebrew, Sfaradim come with theirs, Mizrahim come with theirs. How do we, in bringing the exiles, in kibbutz galuyot, in bringing in all the different Jewish communities to Israel, how do we rectify all those different voices and sounds and accents? And some of that has allowed for the rules in modern Hebrew to become simpler. Ancient and Talmudic Hebrew is much more complex in terms of pronunciation of Hebrew because there are more sounds. Modern Hebrew doesn't have as many sounds, and it's made a lot of our grammatical rules much more simpler so that people could more easily use it in everyday conversation. Okay, these are the main rules for reasons why we have exceptions. Let's go through who are the usual suspects. Okay, instead of asking why are there exceptions to the rule, let's flip that just a little bit, maybe 45 degrees, maybe 90 degrees, and ask, where do we normally find what letters, what phenomenon or phenomena in modern Hebrew creates exceptions? And I broke it down into 4 categories. These are the 4 categories that cause the most problems when we're learning Hebrew, when we're using Hebrew, that often arise exceptions to the rule. Okay, we'll go in clockwise because this is also the order that I did it in. The top left, we have the letter Nun. Nun is actually one of the biggest miscreants in creating exceptions to the rule, and you're going to see why in a little bit. The second is what's known in Hebrew as otiot gloniot. Otiot gloniot are in fancy grammatical term, guttural letters. Guttural, not because they're from the gutter or that they're terrible words. Guttural meaning that they're made in the throat. They're made in the back of your mouth, usually in your throat. These are the letters Aleph, He, Chet, Ayin, and Resh. They're often known as an acronym when learning Hebrew in Hebrew called He'achra. It literally translates to the brother is bad. He'achra or He'achra or He'achra, depending on how you say the letter Resh. But these 5 letters change oftentimes the vowels and thus the pronunciation of certain words. And we're going to go through a little bit of that. Our third category is something called Beged Kefet. Beged Kefet is also an allusion, is an abbreviation of the letters that this involves. Bet, Gimel, Daled, Kaf, Pe, Taf. We're going to explain why those 6 letters also create some changes in pronunciation as well. And then our last one is a really interesting phenomenon, just like guttural letters, just like Beged Kefet, which are unique to Hebrew and Semitic languages. This is another unique phenomenon in Semitic languages called, in Hebrew, imot kriya. When you're learning linguistics or you're learning Semitic language, you'll learn this phrase either in the language you're learning or you'll learn its Latin translation. We don't really have one for English. It's called mater lectionis, however you pronounce that in Latin, I really don't care. Imot kriya is how we say it in Hebrew. These are the letters Aleph, He, Vav, Yud. These 4 letters are guides to us, because as we're going to talk about a little bit, as you well know, in modern Hebrew, as in Hebrew for all time, letters do not represent vowels. Okay, we have those dots and bars that we call nikud to indicate how to pronounce letters with a vowel sound. These 4 letters have been used and continue to be used in certain ways to indicate vowel sounds. They take on vowel sounds in addition to having a consonant sound. Okay, And we're going to go through all four of these and why, some examples, excuse me, of why these four often are at the cause of exceptions to the rule in Hebrew. Okay, let's get to our first suspect, as I call it, the perpetual miscreant nun. And I call it that nun, the perpetual miscreant, because it shows up in exceptions to the rule both in nouns and in verbs. And we're going to go through both today. The fancy word for the sound that nun makes is called a voiced alveolar nasal. There's several different ways that you can create this. Most languages in the world have them. Most languages in the world usually only have 2 of the 4 ways you can make this sound, right? In Hebrew, it's called alveolar. Alveolar has to do with where you position your tongue when you make letters. And in this case, alveolar refers to the alveolar ridge. If you take your tongue, put it right at the top of your 2 front teeth. These are your 2 front teeth, in case you forgot. Right behind your 2 front teeth, there's a little nodule, a little ridge. That's called the alveolar ridge, okay? When you put your tongue there, and then you express a sound that burst of air that comes through both your nasal passage, that's why it's called nasal, as well as your throat, you get the sound n, n, right? N. Okay, you can feel that as well. But in Hebrew, we create that sound by doing that only. Like that, n. In English, you can do it in a couple ways. You can do it with the tip of your tongue. You can do it with the ridge of your tongue, the part of your tongue right behind of or in front of the tip, however you want to think about that. You can also do it with the ridges of your teeth, the back row of your teeth and the sides of your tongue hitting it, right? That sound we can make in a lot of different ways. The roof of your mouth with the middle of your tongue, the sides of your tongue hitting the back of your teeth. We have a lot of different ways of doing that in English based on the word. In Hebrew, we make it easy. There's only one way to make this sound that's considered the proper sound to make when voicing nun, nu, nun, with the tip of your tongue on that alveolar ridge. Okay, so as a result, and this is what I was talking about, it's really important at the bottom when I talked about aesthetics, and it's said here again. Hebrew corrects the speaker to pronounce this sound comfortably. It's not just to make this sound, it's to ensure that you can make the sound comfortably. Because if language is about communication, you need to be able to communicate. If communication becomes painful, you're not going to want to communicate. Very simple logic there, very much true. Let's look at a couple examples. Okay, oftentimes one of the biggest complaints I get is, why does this word conjugate in a way that I thought it shouldn't? If I'm taught that shulchan is a masculine word, why does it end with ot? Why is it shulchanot? It should be something else. I'm not going to say the something else at the moment. I will for the sake of illustrating why it's incorrect. First off, say shulchan, right? Shulchan. And say it with Hebrew pronunciation, not with English pronunciation. U, ah. Okay, so keep your vowels, your mouth doesn't go all over the place, right? English, especially American English, my fellow Americans, we like to add all sorts of other sounds to our vowels so that they become diphthongs and multithongs. That's not Hebrew. Shulchan, shulchan. And that nun, that final nun, your tongue is resting on that alveolar ridge. Okay, practice it now. Shulchan, shulchan. Okay, now listen to how the plural is the correct one. Even though this word is masculine, right? It takes the ot ending. Think of it when you say shulchanot. Now go from the sound shulchanot. Go from na to ot. And feel how comfortable your mouth is by going not, right? Your tongue, by being on your alveolar ridge, making that sound n, is already sort of condensed. It's not open. Your mouth is not wide open, right? You're not pronouncing an E sound or an A sound where your mouth has to go to the sides, horizontal. Your mouth is much more, is much smaller here. O, okay? Shulchanot, okay? Now, don't practice this. Don't say the following thing because I don't want to get you confused, okay? I want you to say, I don't want you to say this following. I want you to listen and watch my face when I do this, okay? Shulchanim, shulchanim. It's wrong on a couple ways. First off, that transition from shulchanim is forcing both my tongue to be positioned differently on the top of my roof, top of my mouth, and it's also adding extra strain in the back of my jaw to get that sound down. And especially because it's shulchanim, right? I can feel it as soon as I say the E, I can feel this stress right here. The jaw bone connects to the body. Shulchanot, there's no stress. Shulchanot, the sounds are, keeps the mouth in the same movement as it was already in, like a, o, okay? U, a, u, shu, cha, shul, cha, not. You can see my mouth even. Shul, cha, not. It's keeping it all straight and narrow and focused. If I was to add something else to it, it would add undue stress. The nun, because it has to be pronounced so specifically, is part of the reason why it's shulchanot. Okay, so it's an attempt to explain to you why it's shulchanot, even though the word is masculine, by understanding how we actually communicate, how we actually create our own sounds, how we create sounds to be heard. Okay, so whenever a word doesn't sound right, put your hands where your jawline, your jaw hits your body and feel, is it extra vibrating? Does it feel awkward? Is something being strained or stretched in your face or neck muscles when you're saying it? Same one with this one, nisayon. Nisayon is an experiment or a trial of something. Okay. Nisayon is, again, a masculine word, and it conjugates in the plural, just like shulchan becomes shulchanot, nisayon, nisyonot. So first off, in terms of irregularities, this actually isn't an irregularity because we're seeing a pattern here. When a word ends like these words with a nun in this specific format, they get conjugated in a very specific way. When they form a pattern, it's hard to argue they're an exception anymore because there is a pattern. We're going to see this again when we get to verbs in just a bit. Nisayon becomes nisyonot. Again, nisyonot is really easy to say because your mouth is already making the yo sound. Nisyonot. Right? Your mouth doesn't have to strain to do anything else. If it was to go back after making the E sound at the beginning in the first syllable, ni, nisyo, and then go to nim, that n gets harder to pronounce correctly. And that next vowel, E, sounds like all sorts of other things. It sounds like yi. In Hebrew, we don't have a vowel yi, right? This is not a diphthong here. It's not the connection of y and e into yi. It's e, nisyonot, okay? So one way to understand this is simply the aesthetics, the sound of it, but also to make sure that we're comfortable in speaking, that it's not undue strain, because if you had to keep saying these words again and again, it's going to add undue stress to our ability to communicate. Okay, let's look at verbs. This is in the back of my dictionary. Any standard printed dictionary will have a verb conjugation table in the back. If you don't have it, I suggest you get one, either an old school printed dictionary. There's the classic book, 501 Hebrew Verbs, which has this as well, but this is found in most of them. You can also find these online. Most Hebrew learning books have these as well. There are tables and tables of verbs in the back of any dictionary, and they'll start with what we call quote unquote regular words, regular verbs. And that's like we did at the beginning with the verb lichtov and michtav. This is what we call gizrat pei nun. Gizra is a form. right? We can think of it as a size and or a type. And pei nun indicates that the first letter of the shoresh that we're talking about has the letter nun. Okay, so as you see here, you have a couple different, I had to chop it up because the book didn't work in this landscape format. But for example, we have on the right-hand side of both of these graphics, we have the verb lipol. Lipol, the shoresh is nun pe lamed. Okay, so as you see here, nafalti, nafalta, nafalt in past tense, right? I fell, you fell. Lipol means to fall. Ani nofel in the present tense, I fall, you fall, she falls, right here on the right-hand side of the screen here. Nafalti, nafalta, nafalt, these are on the past tense. Nofel, nofelet, noflim, noflot, present tense. In the future tense, it then becomes epol, tipol, tipli, yipol, tipol. The nun gets subsumed into the the prefix of that specific conjugation. Okay, so these verb tables tell you not just what are the specific verbs that have these, but it tells you when a verb has the first letter pei nun, right? Pei refers to pa'al, and I'll show this again in a little bit. When the first letter of a shoresh corresponding to the letter pei in pa'al is the letter nun, it's going to act like this in certain formats, in certain binyanim. Okay, if this is over your head, don't worry about it. You're going to learn this at some point when you're learning Hebrew, usually at an intermediate stage. But this is part of why nun is a miscreant. Okay, it has its own table when you're learning verb conjugations. It's that bad of a, it's that misbehaving of a sound. It needs its own special conjugation. Okay, this also explains a lot of other verbs out there that we would otherwise call quote unquote irregular. Laset, which means to carry, right? Laset, the shoresh is nun sin aleph. Lageshet, to approach, nun gimel shin. Latet, to give, nun taf nun. That has two nuns. That makes it even more complicated. Okay, so just know this letter nun, when it shows up in certain places, and you've already seen by watching the patterns of where these letters appear, can be a problem. So you want to be aware of it when words come and they seem odd. This helps explain one of the four sources of it, the letter nun. Let's go to another source of problems, or quote unquote problems. Guttural letters. Guttural letters, like I said, Aleph, He, Chet, Ain, Resh. There are about, I think it's about 5-6 pages worth of grammatical instruction in Hebrew explaining how you use these verbs, these letters, and how they change the vowel sound and pronunciation of words. I condensed it into the 2 rules that you're going to come up with the most. Okay. And even if these are too complicated, don't worry about it, because again, the exceptions are really small. So first off, when a conjugation normally has, with one of these letters, has a silent vowel, okay? These letters are not supposed to take a silent vowel. We call that vowel shva. It's those 2 dots that sit on top of each other. You see it here in lichtov, right? Lichtov. That ch has no vowel. Lichtov. In that first word here, right? Lichtov. It's pronounced with the chet, the chaf, excuse me. Chaf has no vowel. So if you were to write this, say it all together, and you were to pronounce all the different vowels, which we don't do, by the way, in everyday Hebrew, we don't even write the vowels out. It's called shva. Shva, by the way, is where we get the English grammatical term schwa. Schwa is that upside down E that makes the sound not the guttural but the sound, because we do have that elsewhere in Hebrew. But from this Hebrew vowel, we get a very common grammatical structure sound called the schwa from the word shva. Okay, so lichtov. When as you see here, the verb to write, as we had in our first conjugation, lichtov, right? That is the everyday conjugation of binyan pa'al, the first of the binyanim. You plug in the adjective, you plug in the shoresh, and you get lichtov. If you plug in a shoresh, and the first letter is a guttural sound. In this case, it's ayin. It's a guttural letter. We change that, we change that silent sound to an a, and the preceding sound to an a. So instead of lichtov, we get la'avod. Okay? It's the same exact format. It conjugates exactly the same as lichtov. It's just the vowels are slightly different to accommodate for this guttural letter. So ayin as the first letter in a shoresh, in this form, it gets an a sound instead of a silent vowel, and it gets an a vowel, the lamed before it. So lichtov and la'avod. That's for the first letter. What if the third letter is a guttural sound? Let's look at some of these. It's almost the same thing. Now, instead of talking about the infinitive, to write, lichtov, to work, la'avod, we're now talking about at. Second person, singular, feminine. At kotevet, right? I keep using lichtov because that is considered one of the most, quote unquote, proper regular conjugations, right? So in this case, you write, or you are writing. At, female, kotevet. But you open, and the root of open is pe, taf, chet. Chet is one of our guttural letters. At potachat. Okay, it should have those e vowels, but it can't. Okay, it instead changes to a. So potachat, at potachat, at kotevet, ve'at potachat. Okay, and it also happens in one of the other forms. At mitkatevet, you are corresponding. Mitkatev is from the same root. Mitkatevet is from the same root as kotevet, which is from the same root as lichtov. They all have to do with writing. In this case, mitkatevet, corresponding, writing to one another. At mitkatevet, at mitkalachat. Same thing. Hear how it sounds? It goes from an e to an a. At mitkalachat. You are showering. Lehitkalech is to take a shower. At mitkalachat, you are taking a shower. Okay? At kotevet, at potachat, ani mitkatevet, at mitkalachat. Again, I want you to start getting away from using the words exceptions or irregulars, because you're seeing a pattern again and again. When if it's x times y equals xy, think of this as x if x equals blah, 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 and y if y equals blah, 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 right? You're just adding a little annotation to x times y each time to make it clear how to effectively pronounce this. If I was to pronounce this incorrectly, it would be an undue strain on myself, and I'm not even going to attempt it because I don't want to confuse you. But just recognize these patterns, recognize especially the vowel patterns. That's where, especially with the guttural letters, we get the quote unquote differences. And there are significant differences. And at kotevet, at potachat, right? They both are in the present tense, singular, second person, female, you, at. It's just one of them gets one vowel, one of them gets a different kind of vowel. Okay, and you see also, by the way, there's some vocal harmony there. It makes it easier for us to go, just like we did with nisyonot and shulchanot. It makes it easier on our mouth when we keep the vowels as close to each other, as close as similar in identity, similar in sound to one another. Okay, let's get to our next one. This one I'm going to breeze through because it's not as big of a cause for alarm that many English speakers have. Usually it's when the ending of a word is masculine or feminine, and I thought it was supposed to be the other way, right? This one sometimes has that. Beged kefet, you've probably heard this before, beged kefet, and that is the pronunciation, the acronym for these 6 letters. As it says here, the dot found in beged kefet is called a dagish, and it changes the sound of the letter to an implosive. An implosive, think of what I just said. How do you say the word implosive? Implosive. That p sound is one of these sounds. It's an implosive. Your mouth literally, it's a puff of air that comes out. It's imploding as you're saying it, implosive. And all 6 of these letters in Old Hebrew could be written with a dagesh or not. And it, as is wrote here, it changes the sound. In modern Hebrew, only 3 of these letters can change their sound, whether or not they have a dagesh in them. You know what these are: bet with a dot, without a dot, vet. Okay, kaf with a dagesh, chaf without a dagesh, pe with a dagesh, fe without a dagesh. Okay, and you can hear it, that the 3 implosive sounds, b, p, okay, b, k, p. They all, you can feel it. You can feel the air exploding out of your mouth, imploding out of your mouth, especially on your lips as you say them. B, k, p. And also, you can't hold those letters, right? As opposed to other letters where we can stretch it out and keep saying it. You can't with those. You can, however, do that when you take away those, right? So vet, the, right? I hold vet for a longer period. I can't do that with bet. I can make it implosive, bet, but I can't hold it as long as the. Same with chaf, but chaf, right? I can hold, I can't hold for nearly as long of a duration. And obviously the same with the last one, pay, pay, okay? The general rule with this letter is as follows, the one that you're gonna find the most often. When a word in Hebrew begins with one of these letters, it has a dagesh in it, with the exception of words that are not Hebrew in origin. So look at the sample sentence I have here. Ani poteach sefer shel filosofia. Ani, I, poteach, open, sefer, a book, shel, of, philosophia, philosophy. Okay? I open, or I am opening, a book of philosophy. Ani poteach, pa. You can see it, and you can see the dot within the pe in that second word in the first letter, pa. Ani poteach. It starts with one of these letters, it therefore has the dagesh. Ani poteach, sefer, right? And sefer also, by the way, has a beged kefet. It has that fe in it, but this does not take it. Shel philosophia. Why is it philosophia? Philosophia is not a Hebrew word. We use it in Hebrew, but its origin is not Hebrew. Therefore, we do not put the dot in it. Think of it also like one of Israel's treasured foods, even though it is common throughout the Middle East, falafel. Right? Falafel should be falafel, but no one says falafel. You would be wrong because falafel is not Hebrew. Okay? Pelephone, the name of the telecommunications company, which became the catch-all term for this thing, a cell phone, pelephone is a Hebrew word because it's from the words pele and phone. Pele means wonder in Hebrew. Phone, even though we use it in Hebrew, is not a Hebrew word. Phone, like telephone, it's not a Hebrew word. Pele, meaning wonder, is, right? Pelephone means wonder phone. It literally translates to pelephone. And again, it's the name of the first telecommunications company that offered one of these things. Definitely not a smartphone at the time. It was one of those even chunkier things. Okay, that's one of the major rules with beged kefet and why sometimes things are pronounced the way they do. If 2 of these letters follow one another, the second one usually doesn't take a dagesh. That's also another general rule with regards to these letters. As I wrote here, also in the past, the dagesh also indicated a lengthened pronunciation of the consonant. We don't have the same phenomenon in modern Hebrew. Okay, it's something fancy term called gemination. You don't need to worry about it because we don't really have it in Hebrew. We do have emphases on the correct syllable, and that sometimes means that the sound in older forms of Hebrew was a double letter. It's considered a double letter. We don't have that anymore in modern Hebrew. Okay, and finally, the last cause of a lot of what we call exceptions or irregularities are the imot kriya, aleph, hey, vav, yud. Like I said before, traditionally these letters indicated vowel sounds. In modern Hebrew, they're often used as vowels when nikud is not present. Now look at this. This is very important because remember, in Cafe Oleh, I often add the nikud to the words because this is geared towards an introductory level, and thus I want to be sure that you can follow along with the vowel sounds. But in modern Hebrew, we don't write vowels. We don't write the dots and the bars that indicate vowel sounds. Instead, we use imot kriya to ensure that you pronounce it correctly, right? So look here, nisayon. We had that word before, right? Nisayon with nikud, right? We call this in Hebrew ktiv maleh versus ktiv chaser. In this case, with nikud, there is no yud. It's nisayon, right? Nisayon. If I was writing this without nikud, which is the vast majority of times you're going to see this word, it's going to have a yud. Nisayon, to indicate and make sure that you pronounce it as nis. Because if I took that first yud out, that yud between the nun and the samech, you see on the first line here without vowels, if I took out the yud, I wouldn't have a guide how to pronounce this. I could pronounce this in all sorts of different ways that would be incorrect, and thus I wouldn't be understood. But if I see that yud, I know by process of elimination and other words that I know that follow the same root, the same form, excuse me, the same mishkal, this word is nisayon. Okay, so you're going to see this a lot when you see vowel texts. Now, this next one is a little different. Mechupas. When I add the nikud to Cafe Oleh to Cafe Oleh words, because I'm trying to get you to a nikud-free Hebrew, because that's how Hebrew is used on a regular basis, I will add a vav when I am voweling these. It's technically incorrect because the emphasis is on the last syllable, and a vav with the u vowel in the middle usually means that's the stress there. However, as you see here, right, mechupas, which means disguised. We're getting closer and closer to that holiday of disguises, Purim, which is spelled with the vav. Mechupas, mechupas, with vowels, you see how it's spelled, and then without vowels, mechupas. That vav that's added, but no nikud are added, indicates to pronounce it mechupas. When I see mechupas, as it's spelled like here, mem chet vav pe sin, I know how to pronounce it. By knowing the patterns in Hebrew and all the words around it, I know that word can only be mechupas. It can't be anything else. Okay, so these letters are there to guide you through it. They also can create some tension when you're transitioning from voweled Hebrew to unvoweled Hebrew. And last but not least, to give you a further example, they also change the conjugation of certain verbs. Again, those verb tables in the back, like I showed for pei nun, here's the better explanation of it. You see these letters pei, ayin, lamed? We use these when we talk about quote unquote exceptions to the rule, which are just variations, like I said, based on the letters that are involved. So when we use emot kriya, as you see here, there's often a difference in pronunciation when the first letter is yud in a shoresh. Pei aleph, pei ayin lamed here is indicating the shoresh that you use to plug in to a verb conjugation. So let's say we took the verb to go down, laredet, or to descend, laredet. Laredet, it's shoresh, its root is yud resh dalet. Yud, I see here, pei yud. Pei indicates the first letter of the shoresh and that it's yud. Pei yud has its own conjugation table. Lamed hey, when the last letter of a shoresh is hey, has its own conjugation style. Think of the verbs lishtot, to drink, right? Its shoresh is shin taf hey. Or livnot, to build, bet nun hey. Or as you see here on the left-hand side, ayin vav. That's when the second letter in the shoresh has the letter vav. So lakum, right, to get up. lakum has its own way of conjugating this ayin vav form. Okay, so I add these here only to indicate what we would otherwise call irregular really isn't, because if you look at these, they all follow a very specific vowel pattern that we talked a little bit about before. And by virtue of using these again and again and simply looking these up, you're going to be able to use on your own. I'm going to stop here just because we have a few minutes and I see we have a bunch of questions. Janet has a great point here. Janet says, must learn alphabet to learn this language. Must, because of the strong root foundation. Along with how I said Hebrew is 7th grade algebra, spelling in Hebrew is destiny. We've talked about this before, and Janet, thank you for reminding me to make this point again. You must spell correctly in Hebrew. I understand this presents a challenge to those who have all sorts of other learning challenges, such as dyslexia, but that is not the majority of us. Okay, spelling, you cannot sub out one letter for another just because they sound the same. This is actually quite a common phenomenon among children of Israelis who've moved abroad, right? So a lot of children of Israeli parents who grew up in the United States can speak fluent Hebrew. They cannot spell at all, and they don't know how to spell. And that creates a whole bunch of problems when they're trying to write Hebrew, because it's not only that the word may not exist, it may mean something completely different, right? Spelling is no less important than the pronunciation. Thank you, Janet, for that reminder. Sanford, the vast majority of shorashim in regular use with more than 3 letters. I again remind you the amazing website. Let me pull it up again. I always talk about this one. It is a godsend of a resource. Let me just pull it up so I can share it. Sorry, just 1 second. There we are. This amazing website, pealim.com, pealim.com. This is an amazing, amazing free resource, folks. I highly recommend using it. It has all sorts of things on here, not just a dictionary where you can put up any verb and get its full conjugation. It has all these great grammar case studies, lists of podcasts writing with and without vowels. It has great stuff in here. If you are looking for more than this, Sanford and anyone else, 501 Hebrew verbs. It is the classic Hebrew verb dictionary that has 501 shorashim in it, or it's not 501 shorashim, but a lot of shorashim. I highly recommend getting your hands on a copy of that. I see people asking questions or making critiques on me. Thank you for that in the Q&A. Don't have time to address all those. Just going through these. Okay, I see a lot of questions that should have been in the chat, but thank you so much for asking them. In general, we're going to end here as we're at the top of the hour. I hope this was helpful. I hope this was a start to getting a better grasp of how we use the Hebrew language. I understand it can be difficult. I understand this may be a little over the heads of a lot of you, but I also understand when you all come to your respective teachers, including myself, and say, why are there so many irregularities? But this word doesn't make sense. I often teach, and someone will always point out in a very dafka way, and that's a great word to know, by the way, dafka. Why is this word, but this doesn't work the same way. Don't focus on those folks. Again, irregularities often aren't irregularities. It's not just that we're not making up a reason. They actually is a reason why we pronounce it one way or another. Those 4 categories are usually at the source of it. And this was a long way to say there really aren't many irregularities in Hebrew. As someone pointed out, not to use that word. It is not a negative word. It's just understanding the differences and why they come up and how they're addressed. Next week, we are going to continue issues that particularly affect native English speakers. We are going to do one of my favorites, which is common mistakes made by native English speakers. And it's not just pronunciation, it's words, it's expressions, it's phrases that immediately indicate you are a native English speaker. And I'm going to show you what they are, and I'm going to show you how to avoid them by saying what is commonly used in modern Hebrew here in Israel. So we're going to go through those. If you have any specific ones that you continually get stumped on, please write us at Nefesh B'Nefesh. You see the our email in the chat. You can also connect, just email us directly through the website. I will see you all next week, where we discuss common Hebrew problems among native English speakers. Toda rabah and lehitarot. See you all very soon.